Our keynote speaker today is Jim Lukaszewski. Jim is president of the Lukaszewski Group Division of Risdall Marketing in New Brighton. He has an international practice devoted to helping organizations and their leaders respond to extremely serious trouble they are either in or have caused, recover from the damage, manage the victims they create and therefore must care for, and repair their reputation through constructive, workable, ethical approaches. He's one of the most recognized practitioners in American public relations today. He's accredited by both major American public relations organizations, the Public Relations Society of America and the International Association of Business Communicators. He's earned the coveted Fellows designations in both IABC and PRSA as well. In fact, the story of his career was included in the 2009 publication, Living Legends in American Public Relations. Jim is among the most prolific authors and speakers in his profession, with 12 books and manuals and hundreds of articles on crisis management, leadership and organizational reputation recovery, including leadership departure. He's served on the Public Relations Society of America National Board of Ethics and Professional Standards for more than 20 years. Last week in Austin, Texas, he addressed a graduating class of more than 400 American police chiefs and police administrators at the 24th Annual FBI Leadership Academy. His topic was the ethical expectations of America's police leadership, certainly a timely topic in today's society. Jim's communications career began in Minnesota following graduation from Minnesota Metropolitan State University in 1974. He was among the university's first 100 graduates. Today, Metro State has more than 37,000 graduates. He moved his practice to New York from 1986 to 2010, and then returned, fortunately, to us in Minnesota in 2011 to continue his outstanding work. Would you please join me in welcoming Jim Lukaszewski?
Good afternoon. I bring a story with me today. The main player in our story is a man named George White. He was 61 years old and chief executive of a Fortune 500 medical products manufacturer when we met. George came to his company right out of college. Within a few years, he became the senior vice president for sales and marketing, and 18 years before we met, he became the chief executive officer. The occasion for meeting George was his likely indictment by a federal grand jury, along with several other employees, for adulterating a class of medical products. The main production facility in the East Coast had just been raided by the FBI. The story begins with a phone call from a friend of mine with a small agency in New Jersey who worked for George's company. He asked if I would talk to his client, because he was really nervous being around people with blue jackets that said FBI on the back and carried shotguns. He preferred a much different kind of public relations. It was really an unforgettable circumstance for him. Initial meetings like these are usually pretty tense, perhaps a little irritable. The only one who wants to be in a meeting like this with me is me. The client's usual greeting is, "I've heard about you," or "I've heard about people like you," or "I've heard about you people." And I'm not sure I really want to have this meeting, but we proceeded anyway. The first meeting with George turned out to be quite cordial. George is a very gregarious Irishman, great golfer, and a salesman. We both knew why the meeting was taken. The Justice Department had made it quite clear that as a CEO of a Fortune 500 company, they wanted to indict him first before they indicted anybody else in this particular circumstance. The FBI enjoys making essentially public examples of potential offenders and perpetrators. The case would revolve around illegally altering medical products. The legal term is adulterating, resulting in the deaths of at least 2 people. More than 12 people required surgery to repair the damage, and more than 50 people recovered on their own after the product failure. The original indictment alleged several hundred felonies. 6 other employees were ultimately indicted. I agreed to work for this company for two reasons. It was in these situations I'm interviewing the company as aggressively as they're interviewing me. We had some quite extraordinary interviews, especially with the special committee the board set up to manage this particular problem. But I was convinced after meeting with them that they were serious about resolving these issues in a permanent way for this company. They'd hired 3 of top American law firms and one especially a criminal law firm in Washington. I was quite familiar with the criminal lawyers there. The next time I saw George was the morning after the day of his indictment. He was cleaning out his desk and I offered to help. He had just returned from federal court in Boston. I asked him how it went. He said his lawyers had arranged for him to surrender to the court rather than being arrested publicly somewhere near the business in New Jersey. He was quite relieved. He was read his rights, strip searched, fingerprinted, photographed, put in a bright orange jumpsuit with the word prisoner on the back in 8-inch high black letters, manacled and placed in a holding cell with approximately 24 other individuals in similar garb and also manacled. He stayed in that cell for much of the day, was brought into court for his arraignment late in the afternoon. In fact, he was the last arraignment in the afternoon. Again, the government wanted to make examples of these kinds of potential criminals. He pled not guilty. He was released on his own recognizance, and he went back to New Jersey. George had flown to Boston on the company jet, but returned to New Jersey on a commercial flight. In fact, that was his last flight on a company jet. The moment the indictment was issued, George was suspended with pay and was required to move off the corporate premises. As we talked, he continued to put stuff in the boxes, and I volunteered to help him carry the stuff out of his car. As he popped the trunk, he looked at me and told me how greatly relieved he was to be indicted. The thing had dragged out for 2 years. It gets pretty tiresome after a while. But I looked at George and I said sort of incredulously, George, what are you relieved about? And he said, well, you know, for years I've been signing checks to these organizations and doing nothing for them, just giving them money. Now with my suspension, I'll have time to work with these organizations. And I said, George, you're going to spend all your time keeping out of prison. Plus tomorrow morning, your wife and I and you are going to meet in your new off-campus office, call these organizations, resign any positions you might hold with them, and if they want, take your money back, if it's appropriate. None of these organizations could afford to have, or even logically have, a potential felon in any active activity, you know, on their, or in their organization. So, you know, I think that's when I saw the tears from George beginning to sink in. The legal process lasted close to 6 years. During the trial, a rather typical corporate scenario unfolded. It was a story of mismanagement, misunderstandings, bad decisions, good people working with bad people, acting together, consciously ignoring ethical principles and legal restrictions. Those in charge willfully gave false instructions, and they were violating what were some of the clearest regulations prohibiting unapproved alteration of medical products in our legal system. The tragedy began the way many of these scenarios do, at the top of the organization. Someone up top, maybe feeling extraordinarily competitive, maybe just wanted to beat the competition, sent out the word, essentially to do whatever it takes to keep prices low, customers happy, and costs down. It was this message, frankly, this simple command, that led to this company's prosecution and ultimately its conviction. At the time, it was the largest product alteration fine in FDA history. 6 people did go to prison. When it became obvious that the Justice Department could not sustain the charges against George during trial, the judge acquitted him at trial, and he left the courtroom. He went home, back to New Jersey, and he retired the next day. At the trial's conclusion, I helped draft the company's president's allocution. If you're a fan of Law and Order, you recall that this is the part of the trial where the perpetrator takes the guilty plea but must say out loud and in open court the nature of the crimes and take responsibility for them. This is also the part of the trial where the victims' families and the survivors address the court to get their tragedy in the court record, but also to tell it directly face-to-face to the perpetrators. I will always remember those 4 hours in court. As I recollect, the allocution was around 2,000 words, really was a detailed oral discussion of the admission to the counts in the indictment. The allocution process is pretty straightforward. If you want the deal from the government, you got to stand up and say the words out loud in public, no matter how painful, embarrassing they turn out to be. The Boston Federal Court, as a part of its sentencing opinion, said the following, quote, "They recognize the pervasive and powerful corporate culture, which, in their words, exalted profit above the value of human life." Federal Food and Drug Administration's comments were simple in the case and even more interesting. There was no civilian whistleblower in this case. The company was put under very rigorous supervision for 4 years. The board established a new regulatory compliance subcommittee. A new position was created, the senior vice president for scientific affairs, to actually oversee all regulatory changes in the company and to overhaul the entire regulatory system there. I continued to work for several years for the Office of Scientific Affairs, establishing a new compliance program and structure in the company. At the end of the trial, I do recall a meeting. It involved the principal attorneys, consultants, and others, including the new senior vice president for scientific affairs. The meeting began with the president, who didn't actually ever like me, essentially congratulating all these people for all the hard work they'd done getting through this trial. When he finally got around to me, he said, "And then there's Lukaszewski." He looked at me and said, "Jim, whenever you're around, it's a little bit like Sunday school here." And I said, "Tom, if my company had just pled guilty to nearly 400 felonies, a little Sunday school might be in order, don't you think?" Everybody laughed but Tom. Okay. He talked glowingly about all the things they did, but Tom left the company shortly thereafter, and I continued working with the company for quite a while. And I was designing, essentially, with the scientific affairs people, these new systems for the company to work. The goal really was to actually achieve the purpose of the plea agreement, which was to dramatically change the culture of the company to prevent these kinds of things from happening again. Over the years, I've been engaged in similar circumstances and scenarios, some involving the loss of human life, some involving massive loss of animal life. These cases are very similar in their nature. There are patterns of failed leadership, behavior, and inadequate or ineffective organizational responses. I thought I might share just some of the pattern with you because it's quite interesting. Ethical problems in organizations generally start at or near the top of the organization. If they don't start near the top, questionable and bad decisions become endorsed by the top because the top is silent, or because they actually fail to challenge irregular behavior. Ethics violations and problems are rarely the fault of junior people. In fact, junior people are the first ones to bring attention to problems of this nature in a company. But it's their peers who say, I guess they're more seasoned fellow employees who say, don't rock the boat, this could be trouble. It's pretty smart people who do these things. I only am employed by smart people. It's been a strange part of my career. My phrase is, problems like this never start in the mailroom. They start in or near the boardroom. Silence, it turns out, is the greatest promoter and protector of unethical behavior. Studies are done by various ethical organizations every year, and this notion of silence is recognized. For some reason, we observe these things but fail to report them. Most of my professional life actually has been engaged in the understanding, teaching, interpretation, and enforcement of ethical behavior. For 22 years, as I mentioned in the introduction, I was a member of the Public Relations Society National Board of Ethics and Professional Standard. BEP's main goal is really the education, motivation, and inspiration of public relations students, younger practitioners, and to essentially consider and work through ethical dilemmas that practitioners might face. It's a very interesting role to play. Now, having worked across a broad spectrum of ages, beginning with people in late teens to highly educated, successful leaders, has taught me some powerful truths, which are the major drivers of this presentation, as a matter of fact. From my perspective, the highest level of ethical certainty or clarity in a person's life seems to occur between the ages of 19 and 26. Seems to be the time, when an individual knows everything more than anybody else, including their parents. The world seems to be largely black and white. Parents enter what I call the NPR zone, not particularly relevant at the moment. Around age 15 for girls it happens, around age 17 for boys. Boys are always slower. It's between the ages of 30 and 49, though, that I really have learned to pay attention to. This is the time when one's career begins to accelerate, begins to take off, and they begin moving through a period of what I call incremental de-ethicization. There is such a word. All these things they believed in at age 26, all of a sudden, when the career is at stake, there is this incremental process of modifying the certainty of their existence. It's something that happens. All of you can relate to this. And it's an interesting circumstance that we need to talk about. We're going to talk about it today. What I'm talking about essentially is the time for ethical education, it seems to me, is not so much in those early years where there's such certainty, but it's in these later years when our ethical balance is challenged daily by things at work. And what I'm talking about here is there are a lot of business leaders in this room. This is your responsibility. You need to look at your organizations and see what kind of pressures are placed on the up-and-comers in your organization to compromise the principles they've so carefully husbanded, at least up until their mid-30s. You have a role to play in preserving, protecting, and defending the ethical perspective of these people, which really comes under enormous pressure moving forward. I think of it as the most important work of leadership. What makes this particular case so interesting is that literally all the people I got to know in George's company were astounded that the company got into this much trouble. They couldn't believe that people died. Even people who worked in the same division where the raids took place and the products were altered, just didn't seem to get that there was this problem going on. They were embarrassed, in fact, that people had not stepped up and spotted this and reported it as they should have. Even publishing and circulating that allocution from the court, the employer reaction was this, and this is typical. Okay, that's the government's story. What's the real story? What they're saying is, it can't be true, not where I work. One of the most insidious circumstances is that bystanders are willfully blind, including people standing right next to the folks doing this, believing that in their own words, it can't happen here, even if it's going on in the next cubicle. One supervisor comment stood out in my mind from the many transcripts I read in the course of the trial. She said, quote, "We're so with the program that we failed to anticipate that something could go wrong. In fact," she said, "when there were problems, we just fixed them and marketed anyway." And finally, she said, "Those who did not ask tough questions, those who asked tough questions and made waves, wound up in what she called company political hell." Today, this company actually is thriving, saving lives, developing medical products that help provide better medical outcomes. They're still in the Fortune category. And like so many healthcare-related companies, they are surviving a variety of civil suits virtually all the time. I spend a little time working for them all the time on the visibility of some of these cases. But remember, the case lasted 6 years because this was really fundamentally a good company. The pain and shame they so rightly suffered revealed some extremely powerful truths, especially about leadership. And I came to call these lessons the ethical expectations of leadership. They're based on the notion that the leadership of every organization must implicitly and explicitly recognize that there are ethical expectations of others of them, and to understand that if you were to ask people about yourself or about your company, they would talk about the kinds of expectations, whether it's stakeholders, employees, customers, regulators, of the leadership in the company. Because when you do this work, you understand, as I said earlier, this is not a mailroom problem, this is a leadership problem. So here essentially is what the list of ethical expectations of leadership sounds like. Number one, find the truth as soon as possible, tell the truth, and act on it now. Secondly, promptly raise the tough questions. answer them knowledgeably and thoughtfully, and then go farther and ask the questions that have yet to be asked and provide answers for them as well. Third, vocalize core business values and ideals constantly. In my experience, this may sound crazy, but most core values are a set of ideas thought up on a management outing, brought back on the back of a clubhouse napkin. Somebody likes it, they're printed up and put on plaques all over the company, but nothing else is said about them. I see some nodding heads. Walk the talk. These values help people understand the organization through examples that demonstrate the context of its values and ideals at every opportunity. Help expect and enforce ethical leadership. People should be watching, people should be counting, people should know when there are ethical lapses, and they should have a safe way to tell somebody in position of power about it so something happens. Sixth, be a cheerleader, a model and teacher of ethical behavior. Ethics behavior really builds and maintains trust. And in fact, I don't believe an organization can have trust if it doesn't have leaders acting ethically constantly. And by the way, I define trust as the absence of fear, and fear as the absence of trust. But the seventh one I like the best. It's also the shortest. Clearly convey that core values matter more than profits. These come essentially from, if you look at the reverse behaviors, these are the predicate behaviors to the kinds of things we're talking about today. Well, whether George was truly innocent or guilty, something I actually was never privy to. After his acquittal, we never spoke again. But I've seen over the years that guilty criminals, including senior executives and occasional CEO, even the toughest ones, cry when they're confronted with their ethical deficiencies, their ethical blind spots, and their subsequent crimes. Will Durant, in his book, The Story of Philosophy, defined the study of ethics within the context of philosophy as the search for ideal behavior. Lots of definitions out there, but I think this one is particularly appropriate to today as we honor these heroic companies for their work, because the companies you're going to hear about clearly meet the expectations of leadership, the ethical expectations of leadership. And congratulations to all of the companies to be named. Thank you very much.